Let's just give people a few minutes to come on in. And welcome to Youth Civic Engagement and Activism and After School Expanded Learning Programs. I'm also going to start a live transcript here. Everybody's looking good this morning. Chris has a Flourish agenda background. That's looking sharp. All righty. I'll take down my lo-fi music, which is an inspiration from my daughter, who plays lo-fi while she's doing her work. Morning, morning, morning. So glad you're all here. We're really excited to have my colleagues, some of who I know for a long time, some of who I'm just meeting today, to talk with us about youth civic engagement in after-school programs. We are going to, the way this is going to roll out is, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Ren Daraio, and I am the co-director of Temescal Associates and the How Kids Learn Foundation, along with the founding director, Sam Piha. I am going to introduce our panelists. We're going to do a little background on civic engagement. We'll have some questions, and you all get to ask questions in the question and answer button down at the bottom of your, or the top of your toolbar. There's a cool option where you get to upvote questions. So if you see a question that you're really interested in answering, you can upvote it and it moves kind of to the top so we can address those. Panelists, you can see those question and answers as well. I'll ask a few questions at the beginning, and then we'll get to the panelist questions. Sound good? Great. Ready? So who do we have here? We are joined today by Mario Fedlin, the CEO of The Changeist. Hey, Mario.
Hey, how's it going? Good morning.
We're also here with Jamile Ebrahimi, the Youth Organizing Director at RYSE Center. Hello, Jamile.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
John Fuentes is with us. He's a program manager at Bay Area Community Resources. John.
Good morning, everyone.
And also Chris. Chris, can you help me with your last name?
Right, absolutely. Chris Nguyen, glad to be here. Good morning. Happy new day, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Nguyen, Director of Client Engagement at Flourish Agenda. The panelists have extensive bios, which I'm going to run through, but this is a presentation that all of you will get through. And I'll ask the panelists to say a little bit more about themselves as we move through the presentation. So let's get going with a little bit of background in terms of what are we talking about here. It's always helpful to start with terms and definitions. And so let's start with youth activism. And I'm going to ask one of our panelists to read the definition here for youth activism.
I'll go. Youth activism. I'm Mario. Youth activism is used to describe youth who are engaged in community organizing for social change. Young people are engaged as activism planners and leaders in the environmental movement, social justice organizations, as well as anti-racism and anti-homophobia campaigns.
Thank you. And when we're talking about civic engagement, what are we talking about here?
I can jump in. Chris here, everybody. Civic engagement, y'all, encompasses a wide range of actions and behaviors that improve communities and help solve problems. Civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes.
Thanks, Chris. So as
Love
you
that.
see these two definitions, what do you think? Is it missing anything? Does it hit the right mark? Chris is saying yes.
I still think civic engagement needs to be a little bit more encompassing of lived experience and just also existing for some folks and engaging with one another is a form of civic engagement. But I could talk a little bit about that as we move forward. But
Thanks, Mario. Missing some lived engagement. All right. So did I miss something? What's going on here? I did not. Okay. So a little bit about the history of civic engagement and activism. So we know that recent events in the news, such as mass shootings, police violence, have led to a lot of youth participation in national and global movements like March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, and climate change. But they're also, to Mario's point, there are also very local community-based actions that have also happened. We know that this is not new. Civic engagement and activism has been happening for a long time. In 1908, I love this, Mary Harris, Mother Jones organized the first youth activism in the United States, marching with 100,000 child minors. Go Mother Jones. And youth activists have gone on to advocate for voting rights, school segregation, immigration reform, LGBT, and more. Sorry. I'm having issues here. So here is a long list of the benefits of civic engagement and activism. And as you look at this list, from helping young people to build social capital, to providing a sanctuary, teaching collaboration, what are some benefits that come to your mind immediately? Or one of these that resonates with you particularly in this moment?
I think the focus of getting young people involved in youth activism or civic engagement or youth organizing, whatever form or strategies you're using, young people are making changes and creating visions for transformation, if it's their schools, community, or the world. And so it's not only having an impact on the young person's life and the skills that they're gaining, but they're having an impact on their families, their communities, and the world around them and the environment.
Thank you, Jamile. Anybody else want to jump in?
I could say, looking at this particular list, some of this stuff isn't necessarily stuff that we will see right away. It's trusting the processes that are in place, that this will help support the holistic, being of the young people that we're working with. And I like that. And I think that for sure, as we implement programs and ways for civic engagement and youth activism, that we, debrief and use the language to help support young people understanding that how this shows up. So that it can feel it and have language to it as well.
Thank you. All right, so those are some of the benefits, and now we're at the end. No, that's not right. Wow.
It's just one of those days.
It's Mercury retrograde, y'all. Okay, so here are some forms of civic engagement and activism. We got from promoting voting and census participation, to educating others, to writing a letter to a company, to protesting, to what Mario brought up, which was, being in relationship with people in your immediate sphere. What other kinds of forms of civic engagement and activism come to your mind?
Well, I think that's a great list, Ren, and be interested to hear folks in the chat as well. Logging, I see one chat, and thank you, Tasha. I think one of the things that Flourish Agenda and what we'll like to get into today as well is when we talk about civic engagement and activism, there's a component where our young people get to say no. There's a component where our young people get to say, I get to focus on myself right now. That in and of itself is a form of activism. So what we see in the list here is absolutely imperative, but it's also outward facing. And what we want to think about also when we're talking about civic engagement is how do I engage myself in my own healing and identifying my own trauma responses. So in addition to that, we also want to think about how folks and our young people really take ownership and really take agency that we're going to get into about capturing their ability to activate themselves in their own communities in ways that can't necessarily be captured.
Thanks.
Chris, I think that is, I feel like when we look at what some of the challenges with the description of civic engagement that we looked at first is it's really missing that component of saying young people matter and have autonomy and they're full human beings and they're not about being fixed, but they also have the opportunity to understand themselves in a more critical way that then ultimately makes them, part of, the social fabric, and that could heal community. So there's something really unique to that, Chris, and I think that's the thing that resonates with me the most when thinking about civic engagement as we talk about it in the sector, is moving away from the nonprofit stuff about like fixing kids and like kids fixing things to better fix themselves, but thinking about how do we allow young people to be whole and exist and giving them supports in a reasonable way. And part of that is engaging together. So.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a briefing paper that we've written on civic engagement, and everybody who is in this webinar will get a copy of that. It's on our website, temescalassociates.com, along with a lot of other resources. So now, what I'd love to do is ask you a few questions. And as I do this, maybe you can fill in when you first speak a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from and the organization that you're with. So whoever would like to start, let's just talk about the importance of opportunities in the after school space for young people to begin this civic engagement process.
Start. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamale Ibrahimi. I'm the Director of Programs and Organizing based at the RYSE Center. We are a youth center based in Richmond, California, and we support young people ages 13 to 21 to create change in their lives and in their community. We're guided by our theory of liberation, which is focused on systems changing and systems transformation, and ensuring that young people are loved in all the ways that they deserve to be loved. And actually started getting involved in organizing as a 13-year-old when I was in school. I grew up, born and raised in Oakland. And I got involved with an organization called Youth Together. And so that was like my first entry into organizing, into civic engagement, into activism, and really being able to understand why my school was the way that it is, why were there books from the 1970s, why were the schools not having the resources it needed around racism and sexism and all the different systems of oppression. And so being able to really have that critical lens as I looked forward to wanting to create change in my school and in my community. And so I think having those opportunities for myself and my peers at that time was able to, one, get us engaged in organizing, but also created a sense of community, a sense of belonging, opportunities for exploring healing practices and traditional healing practices, exploring things around ethnic studies and being able to learn about our history and cultures, things that you don't really get in schools. Ethnic studies is now starting to be integrated into education, but it wasn't when I was in high school. And so there's a lot of opportunities for young people to even continue to do this work. Like I'm now at RYSE, which grew out of a youth organizing campaign, and young people continue to be engaged civically, no matter what career or pathway that life takes them.
Thank you, Jamal. I appreciate that. And excuse me for mispronouncing your name. All right, who's next? What's the importance of youth opportunities in after-school programs to be civically engaged?
Hi again, my name is John Fuentes, Program Manager with Bay Area Community Resources. I have the wonderful opportunity to work in partnership with 7 schools. Bay Area Community Resources has a bunch of schools throughout the Bay Area, but I get the opportunity to work in partnership with high schools in Oakland and middle schools. I appreciate that you shared your journey. I'll share briefly in terms of after school and being engaged. In a program in Brooklyn, New York, was Yusuf Hawkins was murdered in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And when we went to school, I was young, I'm showing my age. I remember my English teacher, Joan Reale, gave us the opportunity to share space together and talk about this. Why did this happen? So when we talk about allowing the space, so we had a chance to talk about it, talk about how we were feeling about it. And then we got a chance to do something about it. And because it was an English class, she asked, well, would you write a poem or something, right? Write an essay about racism. And I was rapping and doing stuff. And I said, can I write a rap? And she said, sure, go ahead. So I wrote 16-bar verse about racism, about Yusuf Hawkins' murder in Bensonhurst. Turns out it ended up being submitted and then ended up being acknowledged by the Brooklyn Borough president at the time. And it created this movement with myself, along with the whole entire class at Lafayette High School in Brooklyn. And then we went and we marched, right? We were there with Al Sharpton and the parents of Yusuf Hawkins as young people. And that began my journey to think about how important it is for the time, not only in day school, but also after school, because it started in the English class, but we would meet after school to talk about what else can we do? Who can we speak to? How can we stop this? I think the greatest gift we can give young people is the ability to talk about some of what's going on with them in their communities, and then how can we put them in positions to be able to have influence and mobilize. I think that's the greatest gift. And I'll talk more about some specific examples, but I want to honor space. So I wanted to share a little bit about that and that specific example. So thank you for that.
Thanks, John. Really helpful. Mario or Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ren. Is it okay I share screen for a second? All right, thank you, y'all. Again, folks, welcome. My name is Chris Norman, Flourish Agenda. And usually before I kick off, I come from the great and mighty land of Oakland, California, otherwise better and should be known as a lonely land. So as we dig into and get into Indigenous Peoples Day pretty soon, just want to put in the chat real quick for everybody, just in case you don't know. If you want to know what land you own, y'all, nativeland.ca, something to check out, something that we always honor our Indigenous brothers and sisters, man. So a little bit about Flourish Agenda. As we're going to kick off, I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this, y'all. But Flourish Agenda works with organizations who work with young people. And we've worked for over 30 years to really restore hope and foster well-being amongst young people of color, their families, and their caregivers as well. A lot of our concepts and Flourish Agenda was co-developed by Dr. Sean Jenbright, as I'm sure a lot of you have heard. So shout out to Dr. G. Now, because when we talk about civic engagement, when we talk about activism, what we really want to dive into and what John was talking about when he was talking about his rap is really about agency. So how do we give our young people agency? So the picture that you see here is from a couple years back from a camp that we run every summer, Camp Akili up in Oakland. Sometimes it's in Hayward, we've had it in Sonoma, where we curate and cultivate space for folks to feel safe, for folks to heal, for folks to really be themselves. Because we know, and getting to your question, Ren, the benefit for our after school folks here and the experience and the love that all of y'all put into work, we know the goal is aspirations, y'all. So when we talk about activism and civic engagement, we're really talking about aspirations. What can be, not what ain't, right? When we know that young people are regularly engaged, we know when they create opportunities, they build opportunities and embed opportunities into their daily work and their daily lives. Because one of the challenges that we know, y'all, and Jemile and John and Mario, Ren, everybody here, all the 48 people here, we know that when we are trained and doing work with young people, we focus on what happened to them. We focus on the harm that's been caused to them. And the model that we use at Flourish Agenda is more healing centered, when we really focus on what's right with you and really digging into the holistic healing of our young people and what they can aspire to be. Because we know when we dive in, y'all, with young people say this all the time: I'm more than just what happened to me, y'all. It's not just my trauma. And we see it in the day-to-day, right, with our after-school folks. Folks come with their trauma from the day program, right? The day program could have been beautiful, but there could have been things that happened during the day program that I finally get to let it out during the after-school program. And while we know working in after school, as I have too, maybe the day program is a little bit more structured in some ways, and after school you get all the grades. You get second and third grade together. John, you know BACR has a whole bunch of schools and do a whole bunch of work, right? So the nuance that comes in, we don't want to just focus on what happened to the young people, but also their aspirations. And there's some guidelines that we can run through, but the principles that we use to really do this is this thing called karma, y'all. Culture, agency, relationships, meaning, and aspirations. So this is the model that we use as a framework to be able to curate, Ren, that civic engagement that we talk about, to be able to curate the conditions that John was talking about when the adult provider in his space said, go ahead and write a rap. That's the agency that we talked about that foster that safety to really tap into John's strengths as a young person, right? And finally, this is an example. This is a client that we work with in Baltimore. And shout out to Baltimore City Public Schools, because they were on this healing work before a lot of other folks. And when by the time we tapped in with Baltimore, they said, hey, by the way, have you heard about Healing City Baltimore? I was like, what's Healing City Baltimore? Healing City Baltimore was an initiative started by young people in Baltimore, because the communities in Baltimore, adult providers, parents, and young people recognize that trauma-informed care needed to transform to more of a healing modality. And through Healing City Baltimore, an initiative that was created and spearheaded by young people, that led to the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act, which is the first act in the entire United States in any city council that has the word healing in it. Never before. And that was really spearheaded by young people. That was really spearheaded by their civic engagement, their activism. But that came from what, y'all? That came from aspirations. That came from believing in adult providers and the young people cultivating a space where they said, we can actually do this. So Baltimore still is going through its challenges like all of our urban cities in the United States right now. But that is an example, y'all, of where civic engagement, a lot of that stem from after school in Baltimore, can lead to some concrete steps to be able to heal our communities. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate that. Mario.
Chris, I'm excited to learn more too. I mean, that really resonates with me, a lot of the work that you're doing out there in Oakland. So we also, I mean, all of we got to chat. But so I'm Mario. I run an organization called Changeist, based in Los Angeles, and we have a location in Stockton as well. I see that I got my Bay Area peeps on the call here. I'm from San Jose, so born and raised. So I've only been out here for, well, I guess the last decade. So maybe I'm an adoptive Angelino now. But so Changeist. So the idea of growing up on the east side of San Jose, you know, we go through a lot of stuff, you know, and there's like, even if you're in the middle class, your families are the first time in the middle class, hang on to it. And that's also a struggle to try to hold on and grasp. And so we struggled. I struggled with you know, a lot of the same things that you know, families do on some east sides of cities. And I was connected with a camp that sent me out to Santa Cruz, and I had this really amazing experience with like a young person that looked like me, that spoke, you know, spoke differently, but like was funny and just like was not kind of tied up in all the stuff that I was like concerned about at home. And I think really kind of changed my orbit a little bit as a high school student in terms of like who I wanted to be, who I thought I could be, what I wanted to do with my life. And so, you know, fast forward a couple of years later, you know, as I was I kind of dropped out of college because I just didn't really want to I didn't feel like that was for me. I found like these folks walking around in this uniform, and I'm like, oh, homie, like, you know, John used to work for them. Maybe I could work with kids. That seems like something interesting. And I was a 20-year-old kid at that point. And so it was an AmeriCorps program. It's called City Year. I randomly signed up, didn't know what I was getting myself into, and I ended up spending 11 years with City Year, working with my neighborhood and my community in San Jose, running civic engagement programs on Saturdays. We helped launch those similar programs in Philadelphia, and I worked out there for a number of years. And then they ultimately brought me back to Los Angeles to build out civic engagement projects here in LA. And it was a really amazing time. And, and I was like a 20-year-old that was like helping to lead the country and this network of people and building this Saturdays programs. And it was this really kind of whirlwind experience. And after I've kind of got off the arc of like building a lot of stuff, I started thinking back, I'm like, man, like my trajectory got me here, but I started when I was 20, but I felt all these things and this urge and this need to like do something and build way before that. Why couldn't I do it? I grew up in a sports family, and there's nothing wrong with sports, but when I use a sports analogy, we know that we will put our young people in soccer or baseball as early as 5 years old and build that skill all the way throughout because we just know it's good. But you also don't expect anything else except for play, right? You don't expect outcomes. You don't expect, you just like, you get to go play on a team. But we don't do that with community engagement or activism. Instead, it's always trying to fix kids, right? It's always trying to fix somebody if you're in some sort of program that's not necessarily focused on like a sport. And so when I was 20, I thought about it and I was like, well, what would my life be like if I had this type of experience when I was, 11? How different would my trajectory and my arc be? And so to kind of figure out and play with that, that's what we ended up building. Changeist was like, how do you create a new civic institution that allows people access to other change makers, to have them have a place where they could come and just like think about the challenges in the world, get some history, learn from other activists in the field doing the work, and create a critical mass of young people and a social fabric and social capital to where they could tap into along their road. But the thing is, for us, we don't necessarily we're not organizers in the sense of like we have a piece of legislation or something that we want to shift, and so we mobilize these hundreds of folks. Instead, we bring them together and say like, what do you want to talk about? They get to decide, and then we curate really unique experiences on the team for those folks, and they come from lots of different spaces. So in Los Angeles, you'll have young people from South Central and Boyle Heights and Beverly Hills and Santa Monica and Pacoima, all on the same team, talking about things like housing and talking things about race relations and immigration. And that in itself is powerful because now you're starting to have lots of different perspectives at the table, which we didn't have before, because oftentimes we're thinking about place-based when we're doing organizing, which is not a problem, but there's a space, I think, to be filled, or how do you bring young people together to understand themselves in context wherever they sit and allow them to have agency to do whatever they want. And as adults, we could tear away some of the red tape. So that's kind of what Changeist does. And that's why I'm kind of in the space of like really thinking about what does it mean to understand yourself in context, and understanding yourself in context is really what is going to nurture and shift our systems over time in the long game, and that's kind of the work that we're in.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I have 3 questions here. You can choose the one that you're most interested in answering. We've heard a lot about the personal benefits already from each of you, but what are the benefits for young people when they're civically engaged? What are program benefits? How does the program itself benefit? And, what are some challenges that we need to be aware of when we begin to embark on civic engagement and activism? Benefits to youth, benefits to program, challenges.
I'll speak, if that's cool. Lots of benefits. And again, some we see right away and some may take a while for us to really see. One of the things that we do as an organization is intentionally collaborate and partner with providers like Attitudinal Healing Connection and Rainbow Chefs and Californians for Justice and Youth Alive and Oakland Kids First, who, if you don't know, was able to get the bill passed. So next election, students 16 and 17 will be able to vote for school board for Measure QQ that passed, and that was youth led. I like to say it's from the survey to the seat. Oftentimes we survey students, but do they really have a seat at the table? Did they really have voice? The benefits, I think, are keeping young people engaged. Mario mentioned the sports reference. I think one of the reasons why there's such a high retention with sports oftentimes is because students practice and the following week they have a game. And sometimes expanded learning programs, it takes a really long time to be able to see like, oh, when is that project-based activity that you're working on? When is it? It takes a month or 2 months. So really acknowledging the space that we're in and asking and almost making it a real expectation that if you're doing a culinary arts program, how do you have the conversation as you're sauteing around food deserts and food justice? And then how do we allow students in that program who are cooking, right, and preparing meals to talk about what's on their mind and how they maybe want to mobilize? And what that does is it builds retention. And in turn, it builds a safety space for young people to consistently be engaged and involved. And in long term, it creates positive outcomes, right? Yeah, so I'll stop there, but there's some other examples I can give specific, like our HOPS program that will work with the healthy point of sale. When you're checking out and young people are like, why is there always junk food at the counters? Whenever my mom or I'm checking out, what can we do about that? Huge campaign. So offering that opportunity. I'll pause though, because I don't want to take too much space, but lots of benefits.
Thanks, John. All super exciting. Anybody else? Benefits to youth, benefits to program, challenges.
I think there's been a lot of research done, if folks want to look into it, by Dr. Veronica Tariquez around the benefits and trajectory of young people who've been, and I can look for it and drop it in the chat also, for young people who've been involved in youth organizing or civic engagement, leads to higher rates of young people actually going to and finishing higher education. And we know that also leads to higher probability of economic sustainability for them and their families. And so those are like, there's like the individual benefits to young people. I think just to go back to what Chris lifted up around agency and having power, it's around not only having agency and power in a campaign, but how do I advocate for myself and all the different things that we will navigate as adults, as parents one day, in a job, in the community, with our landlords, whoever it may be. Like, how do we create that sense of agency, and also that young people know that they're standing in their power when they're doing that? And I think in terms of benefits to the program, for us, I see young people have are able to guide how the program is run and what happens in the program. So we do a lot of listening to young people as we design the programs here at RYSE. Even right now, I'm sitting in our new campus that will be opening in the spring of next year. And young people, there were 400 young people who helped inform how the building was designed, what the architecture will look like, that there's open lights and that there's windows everywhere. And even over this last summer, young people spent the summer deciding what policies would be set in place in the building, what would be the visual aesthetics of the building. And so young people have a role to play, not only in making transformation or being engaged civically in their community, but even within our programs, there's a role that they should play, and that they should have power and influence over how our programs are run. And there's many different opportunities for that to happen, even staff hires. For RYSE, every staff person who's a staff person today had young people on the hiring committee. And if young people are like, no, we don't want that person, or it doesn't feel right, those folks don't work here at RYSE. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can integrate the youth power that we're trying to advocate, the getting young people ownership or in positions of power, or activism out in the school or in their communities. We can also create those same opportunities for young people within our organizations.
Thank you. I love it. I'm hearing so much of the fractal nature of engagement and activism from the small is a mirror to the whole, right? Small to whole. Appreciate that. Chris or Mario, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Really quickly, I think Jamila and John, y'all have so much experience in extended learning, right? I'm like, y'all the experts here, you know, and I'm learning from you as well, right? But just kind of bouncing off of kind of what both of you have expressed and said, I think the benefits of civic engagement and youth activism and extended learning programs is just the ability to try something different, y'all. And I go back to that because we want to reshape and we want to rethink some of the rigidity that comes from school. right? So as we think about how young people are in a lot of ways forced to operate in schools, and I know there are teachers probably on this call, and this is no shot at teachers because we know teachers themselves don't get the support they need to be able to be flexible and creative in their programs, right? But how many times have we asked or we seen a straight line, bubbles in your mouth, walk on the line, make sure with hands by your side, all of these contraptions that we almost force on young people during the day program to make sure we get through the day, right? But extended learning programs offer the ability, like Jamie was saying, at RYSE, where young people can create and co-create opportunities where they feel the agency to be able to take ownership of their own education, right? I think one of the things comedian Steve Harvey said one time, you know, we're not getting into what we agree with or disagree, but one of the things that resonated was when he was talking about dreams and he was talking about goals and he was talking about purpose and meaning. He said, and he was like, truth be told, in a room for educators, he was like, this might not land well with y'all. But he was like, education ain't the most important thing in the world, y'all. I was like, where he going with this, right? I'm interested in hearing. He's like, the most important thing in the world is to find your purpose. And once you find your purpose, education will come. Because to get to that purpose, I know I have to go here. So that's a reframe of what we're basically saying, right? Is be able to capture a connection with the work itself for what young people are interested in, and extended learning programs have the ability to do that. Let's say we don't have to walk in the line to the lunchroom. Let's say when we're going to get snack and extended learning, how can that look different? And how can we show administration, how can we show institutions that this different way of doing things, this creative way of doing things, because y'all just put second, third, and fourth graders in my class because y'all ain't hired enough after school staff, right? So how can we show a different way of being able to do things? So that's one of the benefits to it. Ren, the challenge of it is obviously y'all trying to buck a system, y'all. Y'all trying to buck an educational system that is designed for young people in some ways to fail. And we all know that. That is designed and hasn't evolved in 60 years. Outside of maybe, you know, Common Core or something like that. We're still doing the same thing we've been doing for decades, y'all. So where extended learning can really come from is to operate and show and display a different way. Even if institutionally it don't change right away, John, as John says, young people can feel it right away. The second they step in the classroom, they can feel the energy. And that really helps to change the way they think about school. So that's one of the things immediately that come to my mind.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, there's something to, I think, John's point where it was like, you know, how do you help, you know, young people see themselves in that cooking class, right? You know, how do you kind of bring in themselves in context? And then you could start talking about challenges, right? Food, where do I live? You know, all this, you know, all this is all very Freirean, right? So it's just like, you know, how do we kind of train youth workers to see beyond the outcome and the output, and think about young people as whole people, and that we are engaged right now in something. And I think that's what civic engagement ultimately has like in its forefront. But really, we should be thinking about engagement with young people all across the board, whatever it is in education stuff. And now I'm critical of even some of our biggest educational, you know, tutoring systems. It's like, look, you're trying to pour stuff into a cup instead of trying to think about a young person as not a widget, as like a person who needs to first get to a place to be like, I feel like I can engage with you. I feel like you see me, and now we could talk through different things. And now I could accept and learn, right? You got to do some. So I think there's like a step back a little bit and saying like engagement needs to be better with our young people, right? First, you know, when it comes to like the challenging of the, you think on the civic engagement side for after school providers or out of school time providers, I think sometimes we get stuck in the output or the outcome. Again, just like the other educational species, when we're thinking about, you know, you could ask a young person, what are some of your biggest challenges in your neighborhood, your community, your church, whatever it is, and you'll start a conversation. And that's where you got to start. You got to start where people are, what they're seeing, and then help them dissect it. You know, we could guide those conversations, and that would lead to something that's authentic, right? What is less helpful, and not to say it's problematic, but what's less helpful sometimes, especially when we're trying to get started, is saying like, here's the problem, how do we fix it? You know, you could bring students to that, and it'll take a little bit more time. But on the other end, you know, we should be starting with like, you know, let me see you as a community first, and now let's talk about what are some things that we want to do here together. I think works more authentically. I think from the design side, from that space, it's much more, it's much easier. It's harder. Okay, it's harder, but that outcome becomes something. I saw someone in the chat talk about authentic kind of outcomes. And I'm just, from my standpoint, I think what you had mentioned too, Chris, resonates as well, is like that kind of idea that like education isn't the end all be all. It's about how do we understand ourselves, and how do we understand ourselves in relation to one another, and how do we do that in kind of any kind of aspect or any touch point with the young person in community. And that's where I think the nurturing and the disruption of our social fabric come from, in that kind of moment of like, this is me, I see you, person, we may not see eye to eye, but now we could start to kind of go after it, right? There's something unique there that kind of like nurtures and disrupts that social fabric, that I think where the sweet spot would be, opinion.
Yeah, thank you so much. My son came home. My son has an incredible history teacher at school, and it's the highlight of our day when we're always like, what happened in history today? And the history teacher told the class that education was a meritocracy. So I said to my son, what does meritocracy mean? And he started laughing. He was like, actually, he didn't give us a definition for it. He made us look it up. And his son friend was here and said, well, what's that? If he's not going to teach, then what's he's in teaching for? And Kai said to him, yeah, no, he's teaching us how to learn. That's what he's teaching us. He never gives us answers, ever. In fact, the first 2 months of school was all we teach. So we brought up the topics and we taught the class. So there is no curriculum, he said. And just an example of, brilliant teachers out there who are trying to work against a system that's really, like you said, hasn't changed for a number of years. All right, so we have some of the, what kinds of tips would you give to program leaders who are out there and going, yeah, okay, what you're saying sounds great. How do I get started? What do I do? Come on, people, we need the silver bullet here.
Hey, I'll start. The tip would be something that I referenced to earlier, is who are your staff members? What kind of, really identifying what they're passionate about, what their interests are, your providers. And I say from my perspective, as I'm partnering or, supporting and collaborating with providers who are going to be in front of young people, who are they, we say authentically, what are they curious about? And then really preparing them. So if a young person in Oakland is bringing up, housing as an issue that they're really concerned about, either they themselves are going through it or their families or someone in their community, how do we connect them with a council member in their district, council member Caleb, who may be, passionate about housing. So allowing and supporting our team members with the information to learn how to introduce this. If you're doing a therapeutic beat making class with Today's Future Sound, what are those conversations you're having as young people are pounding on those pads, right? And then how can they take this piece of music and inform it? So my tips would be, one is to make it part of the culture or a practice where all providers who are leading instruction with direct service with staff have an opportunity and a space to tap into young people's whole self. Where are they around this? And then how does that resonate in the broader community? Because again, I think the greatest gift we can give is our young people the ability to find their voice, express their voice, and see how that can create change within themselves and the broader community.
Thanks, John. Mario, were you gonna say something?
I would say, we also have first acknowledge that, oftentimes when we talk about like, how do you kind of move the levers of power in your city or your community, we assume adults know how to do it. And we don't always, right? It's like, and so I think that's something we have to recognize first. It's like, all right, so if we are going to do it, or if we want our staff to run some sort of, allow them to understand it's okay to not understand all the levers of power, but now we have to think about what does it mean for us to be a community of practice, and think about how do we want to help guide the learning or be cognitive models for like learning, and then figure out what the design comes and after that. Because to be able to say like, all right, well then go do, get those young people to take it to the city to do some sort of legislation organizing. And the people are like, well, how do I even understand how Oakland City Hall works? Because it's been designed to keep people out for such a long time, right? So there's got to be that kind of recognition on the practitioner side of like, how are you feeling? How are you prepared? And like, how do we then, again, start where our staff's at? Because that's the only place you can, unless you're going to do a whole lot of extensive like learning together as a group. But I think that's one thing I would pick out.
Mm-hmm.
I think a place to start is really thinking about what it means or what it looks like to be an adult ally or to be in solidarity with young people. And there's a lot of different ways that can look. I think one is just first remembering that the work that we're doing is in service to young people. And often sometimes it's easy to get stuck in being in service to systems or funders or the widgets, and remembering that today we're showing up and I'm doing this work in service to young people, and I have to push back on the systems that are often causing harm to young people. And I need to show up in solidarity for them. Sometimes that maybe I have to take a risk. I may have to engage in healthy struggle. I may have to own my own power and privilege that I'm holding as an adult or in my education or whatever it may be. We also need to really think about how are we tending to what young people are saying that they need, want, hope, and expect, and that there's a lot of different ways that can look. And listening to young people, validating their experiences, partnering with them, asking them what they want and need, and being the adult to show up. And I think before even getting into thinking about like, how do I structure a program, or how do I create the curriculum, or how do I have this conversation? It's just, how do you show up as an adult ally? And for young people, listen to them, and they'll tell you what they need, what they want, how they need you to show up for them, and to be that trusted adult.
Thank you. Yeah, it's also one of the things that I heard John talking about, which is really fascinating to me. It's like we're going to get at whatever civic engagement or activism through the content that we are providing. So when we're in Beats, that's the context through which we can begin to listen to and hear youth and ask youth questions. So it's not the widget of making the beats, but actually the purpose is far grander, right? It's not making the meal, it is making the meal and helping people understand the context that they're in. That's a really deep thing to try to communicate to staff people, right? That's a big one. All right. Let me just open up the floor. Is there anything else that you want to say before we take questions from the group out there who's listening?
I think I just wanted to highlight the one last thing. I think
Please.
Before, again, talking about the civic engagement piece, this goes back to like what the kind of, it was like, how do you, if whatever programming or cultural institution you're a part of, like the school, it's like, do we see young people first? Right. I feel like that goes to the point of like, figuring out your orientation. It's like, no matter if you're going to do math, do science, it's like, does your institution see young people not as things to be fixed? Then that's a start. Then you got something to start with.
Thanks. Anybody else want to add something before we take questions? All right, panelist. Sabina out there has asked, how can we support youth's well-being while they engage in activism in their communities, which is rewarding, but also taxing at times? And Sabina, I can open up your mic if you want to hear and respond to the panelists' answers. How do we support young people's well-being while they do this work? What say you?
Right, absolutely. I love that question, Sabina. And I think at Flourish Agenda, one of the things that we really lift up and talk about is this concept called social toxicity. There you go, Sabina. And social toxicity is a theory that was coined by researcher James Gabarino. And social toxicity really talks about the conditions within our shared environment that are almost like social toxins that come through us, but we can't see them, but it affects us and it affects our ability to heal. So one of the things that we do at Flourish Agenda is we really operate and we really create containers where young people and their adult providers can really understand some of those social toxicity concepts and really comprehend what is really making them and preventing them from being able to heal. So these includes things like racism, homophobia. You can go on and down the line. So one of the things that we really want to link up is in the difference and or as we're talking about, right, and building off of trauma-informed care to more of a healing model is that it's not really lies in the individual, but it lies in the collective. So as an example, a young person in Oakland might have the same visceral experience to getting pulled over by the police or the police driving down the other way of the road as it is in New York, as it is in Los Angeles, New Orleans, Gary, Indiana, wherever you want to go. So that is a collective shared experience of what researchers like Jeff Duncan Andrade calls persistent traumatic stress environments. So that's a concept that I really want folks to start using if you haven't heard anymore, because we know about PTSD. But PTSD talks about what happened over there, and I get triggers from what happened over there. But what folks are really understanding, and sociologists are really understanding now over the last decade or so, is this persistent traumatic stress environment means there are small micro triggers that happen every day and continue to happen within our communities for both young people and the adult providers together. So I can get into that a little bit more, but that's really where we want to start, is to understand what is preventing you from healing and understand what are you trying to heal from. And that's how you can really start to have conversations about well-being as well, because if young people don't know what well-being actually is and what is preventing them from being well, then it's hard to really get at the root of that concern and that issue. So yeah, that's a great question.
Thanks, Chris. Sabina, do you have a follow-up question for Chris, or do you want to make a comment?
I just said, thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, I was asking because sometimes I've been doing check-ins. Sometimes I ask people how do you like to be supported when you're having a bad day, or how can we support your well-being? And they just say oh, I don't know. So it's well, how can I show up for them when they don't know what they want or how to be supported? So thank you.
Does somebody else want to respond?
I can share a specific example and a story of what happened at a school that I've been partnering with some time. Emiliano Zapata Street Academy in West Oakland. Many years ago, they partnered with Nairobi Yoga, and adults started doing yoga, and students became curious, how is that going to help fix or heal? And I know it's yoga, it's one way, right? But students, they started doing transformative life skills at the school, and it became part of the culture. So students started doing mindfulness and breathing and meditation, and even those who were curious, I don't want to do that, started doing it, and it became part of the school culture. A few years ago, we received a grant from Oakland. I know this may be controversial, but how do students build relationships with local police in Oakland, right? How are we going to do this? So within asking the students what they think they can do, they identify that there's a tent town, they call it, right down the block from where the school is. And they realized that, part of their service learning project, because they decided, they went and asked people who were living there, what do you need? And they said, we need sanitary, we need toothpaste, we need toiletries. So the students started getting that. And then one day they went there and they saw police there and garbage trucks getting rid of all the belongings. And that really bothered them. So they decided that what they want to do this practice is take their ability, as they themselves are healing as students with mindfulness and meditation as one part, to bring in the officers that were locally on that beat. And they came in and started doing this with them. And they said, our ask as young people in this community is that if you have to do that, can you at least do it in a way that respects the residents of the tents? Can you ask them what they would take? Can you at least do that? Can you at least and again, the story goes on, but that's what they chose to do because they realize with the healing. And when you do that, use the mindfulness transformative life skills that us as students are teaching you. And it was pretty impactful. Again, controversial because all that's going on. And we know there's a lot of other things we need to do systemically, but in the moment, that's what young people decided to do. And it actually, went quite a bit of ways where the police officers committed to coming and doing mindfulness with students. So they were healing with the students. And then as they had the conversations with those in town. So it's an end again, right? It was an end.
Yeah, so it's bringing in different kinds of practices like mindfulness, yoga, or whatever the practice might be.
Yep.
Sabina, you want to comment?
No, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Other ideas about how we support young people's well-being while they are living.
I just want to kind of tie that up in a little bow a little bit, like as a practitioner, a youth worker, right? If I have a group of folks that I'm supporting through as they're organizing, I would also be thinking about, especially that question's a little limiting too, is like, how can I help you? Sometimes you lock up, but also then thinking about, well, what kind of space do I provide every week that I check in with you? Is it like we're always just doing our check-ins? Is it consistent? And then that's where you bring in those things like, let's just do some mindfulness because that helps me support, or give them the option to be like, maybe we should try something new. I think you've heard about in those other organizing circles you want to bring into the space. And so really kind of just giving folks a smorgasbord of like tasters, and also having them bring things or sharing, or kind of creating a container for them to feel open and vulnerable, allows them to then open up and start to reflect a little bit on their experiences while doing the hard work, and being in adult spaces and trying to organize and filling all those feels.
Thank you. Jacob has a question here. He is asking, how can we get our youths engaged in activism that is genuine and that we can see youths continue these ideas and skills in the future? Jacob, I'll bring you up. Whoops, apparently not. Don't see Jacob. Not sure what happened. Okay, well, I try to get you up, Jacob. What do we think?
Jacob's here.
You see him?
Oh, sorry, I don't have my video. Oh, all right. So, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Give me 1 second. Oh yeah. Just regarding my question is that I've always my fear is always when I want to get my students into activism or something like that, it's that they're doing it because they see an adult that's interested in it and they'll act for it and they'll act passionately during that time. But I want it to be coming from like a genuine place where obviously, from what I'm hearing is like getting from what they don't lead them on, ask them, and we'll have that be the conversation to lead on to for, in your after school program, for them to be like, oh, I'm really interested in, our school, reducing homophobic slurs or something like that, that they're passionate in it and we focus on that. But how do we do that in a way where it's there and they have the skills so that in the future they can continue on, or at least have that ability or mindset to just kind of continue doing that, but it just remaining, with a lot of the things that happened in the past couple of years and how the rise of activism's grown and how social media's gone, it kind of seems trendy a little bit. And that's my one fear with a lot of my scholars, with a lot of my youths, that it's just a trend that for the moment, and it's not going to be something that's, continuing on. I hope that kind of made my question.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. So how is it? How do we support young people in engaging genuinely, and what do we do when this becomes not a trend anymore?
Well, I will say, I think even though it's not top in like trend of what we're seeing in the news, youth organizing, similar to the early presentation, or youth activism, is always happening, even though we may not see it happening on social media or even before social media. I think the organizing and activism that I engaged in was built on the backs and the legacy of youth organizers who came before me, and will continue to move work forward. And so it's always happening in different forms. And there are a lot of powerful youth organizing, youth civic engagement organizations across the United States. And I would say one thing that was helpful, I think even in my own personal experience as a young person, was that the adults provided us with the training and skills and the autonomy to decide how we wanted to move forward. And often sometimes where it may felt risky for them, or we pushed the bar in places that maybe didn't feel comfortable, that they allowed us that space to do that. And so one of the campaigns when I was in high school, I went to Skyline in Oakland. We organized to get a youth center on our campus. And it was one of the things that we wanted. We faced a lot of complaints and racist apprehension from the neighbors who didn't want students to stay on campus after school. They wanted students to go to school. Most of the students coming from the flatlands. They want students to come up to the school skylines on the hills in the Oakland Hills if folks aren't familiar with the area. And at 3 o'clock, it's time for them to go back home. And they didn't want young people to be on campus for longer periods of time. But it was something around, we knew that young people needed a central place to find resources, to convene, to continue to organize and to be activists. And so we continue to push on that. And so having that space to know that even though we were fighting against untrue ideas of how young people are, who young people are, that we had adults who would continue to support us and move the campaign forward. And so even after that campaign, we provided, as I moved into a staff role at Youth Together, providing space for young people to understand what's happening in their schools and communities and become passionate about an issue and supporting them. And it's not so much guided by, well, this is what the organization is focused on, or this is what we're doing, but how are young people really guiding the work forward? So we actually did a campaign around making sure that young people had voice and power in the school district. And so we did campaigns around that. We did campaigns around the stopping the California high school exit exam, or changing the funding formula around how education is funded at the state level. All of those things were informed by young people, and young people really drove how those campaigns move forward. And it's the place of sometimes we have to step back and allow for young people to step in and take lead, and that we're supporting them as they need to. And it's also allowing them to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes as well.
Thank you. Jacob, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. I think that really gave me a better vision of how to approach this with scholars and with people in program, for sure. I think one follow-up, and I think just with some of the ideas like, having students working against protesting or being activists against the exit exam for high school and all that. What part of us as adults do we have to sort of not push it, but at least provide the information or the data that can be helpful? Or is it more that we still just kind of push, step away and just give the resources so they can find it on themselves? I think that's where I'm also, as the adult, I'm sort of not 100% sure is it 2 hands on or 2 hands off for our scholars so that the activism does ring true?
I think it's a mix of both, and it depends on the situation and time. I think after the 2016 election in November, many students walked out, and students in Richmond walked out of school, and it was our role as adults to not step in, to not take away their power, to not quell their anger and fear, but to really support them in an activism in that moment. And so providing them resources at that moment was providing Know Your Rights handouts, providing them with water, helping them keep safe in traffic, creating safety, and being a liaison for law enforcement and other adults who weren't supportive of their activism. And so sometimes it's creating that safety and allowing them to step into their leadership and be able to express anger. It's not a bad thing for young people to be angry or to be sad or to be fearful. And so giving that space for that to happen. And then sometimes it is being an adult and having the information. These are resources. We do a lot of work for supporting young people who are involved in the district LCAP committee, which is the local control affordability plan, the local control accountability plan for the district that creates an equity-based funding formula for our schools, and young people are supported in that process. And so we have a staff person who supports them in their engagement in that space to make sure that young people are supported. And so the staff person actually meets with them and goes through these hundreds of pages of documents to walk them through it, to make sure that they understand and that they feel prepared to actually suggest, inform, and advocate for increases or decreases in different funding formulas. And so there's different ways that, depending on what the campaign situation, activism looks like, so there's different ways that adults will have to step up, step back, or step to the side.
I think also as adults, we have to recognize that we don't get to choose what people do with this information or their skills, right? The only thing we get to choose is kind of how we create space and be an ally, right? So I think, one of the things is, as a practitioner, it's like, am I doing the best to make sure young people are seen, to be responsive and a good ally? And if that's what you're doing, we don't get to choose what the outcome is or what they do long-term with this stuff. That's for them to decide, because that's part of autonomy and allowing young people to space to kind of make their own choice.
Yeah, thank you so much. For sure, if we provide information and resources and skill development, that doesn't make the activism or engagement any less authentic on the part of young people. It's working together to bring about change, I think, yeah. Okay, Tasha has a question for y'all. Let's see, can we talk more about how to build the skills that you're talking about with youth development practitioners? It seems to be the classic nature versus nurture regarding the with itness of the adult to support youth in the ways you're describing. Tasha, I'll bring you up. Oh, I don't see you in anymore. All right. So what do we think? What are the skills? You
I
are
see
here.
I see Tasha in the attendee list.
Can you bring her up? I didn't see her.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Welcome.
Right. Yeah, Tasha Johnson from the YMCA. Hey there. I am so curious. These kinds of conversations always lead me to what are the intentional ways that you introduced on board some of the skills that you're really alluding to that support the behaviors that you see in youth. So things like, for example, for young people to be able to articulate, when someone else asks the question, how can I help you, really is a pathway that it takes in my opinion, a skilled professional to create, cultivate, and support. And I feel like it always gets down to the nature nurture conversation for those who are, to an extent, innately good at building relationships, innately good at building trust with individuals. There's less of a gap to develop those skills that go into, like, explicit skills that go into developing relationships. So can you talk to us from your perspective about that? Because what triggered that thought was, Chris, when you were talking earlier on about the kind of duality between the day program and the evening program, you know, I absolutely think that not all children need to walk around with bubbles in their mouths and walk in straight lines. But I think the tension that we see with, should I get vaccinated or not? Should I wear a mask or not? Starts at simple behaviors that, you know, we all can't just run around the hallway, because somebody who may not necessarily be able-bodied can fully experience that joy in the same way. And so my spirit of generosity says, I'm gonna walk behind you so that I don't knock you over, even if I have to repress what my natural urge is telling me to do. And I think that the more that young people have those opportunities to practice that decision-making with some support and or organization from a skilled adult, when the stakes get much bigger, as what we're seeing in the pandemic, more logic and more rational behavior, my hope and aspiration starts to take place. So I'll go back to that essential question, like, what's that tension, or how do you cultivate when you know the withedness between folks who are naturally good at doing the things you all are describing, and when you actually have to be intentional and deliberate about developing an explicit skill?
Yeah, Tasha, that's an amazing question, and I really appreciate you for bringing that up, right? Because especially in extended learning programs, you know, sometimes turnover of staff, it's a little bit higher, right? Sometimes it depends on your budget, right? Whether at the YMCA, at a recreational center, or after school program, sometimes there are factors beyond your control. So you will have some folks who are more with it, right? Who can come with it right away. All right, they got it. You know, just simple reminders of, you know, school culture, things of that nature, and they're doing their thing. But other folks who come in and who are really also very passionate about working with young people might not have some of the skill sets to be able to capture that, right? And that's a question that I think I would want to pose to everybody on this call, because I think that's a collective you know, experience that we can all add on. For me, and speaking on my personal experience and just an idea, right? This is just not the end all be all silver bullet, but one of the things that we talked about even on this call, which is absolutely important, which is centering the voice of the youth, which is the most important thing, absolutely. However, we also have to talk about centering the voice of the actual adult provider as well. So when we're talking about things like professional development, Tasha, and onboarding and things of that nature, we want to ask, as an example, a quick paradigm shift. Every day, Mario, we work together, you know, John, we work with Ren, we work together. We come in and I say, how y'all doing? Or how you doing? But what if we shift that and say, how you healing? How would that change things, right? So that's an example, right? How are you healing? Damn, you gonna hit me with that in the morning? How am I healing? I don't know, bro. I took a nap, you know? But, you know, from a work perspective, though, we really want to capture both some of the perspectives that folks understand and they can name as adult providers that they don't have yet. So to be able to cultivate spaces like that. Now, I recognize that in the hustle and bustle of capitalism and the hustle and bustle wanting to be present for young people, sometimes we don't have the space and capacity to carve out to be able to work on some of those adult building relationships. But what I would offer and what I encourage is for folks inside your organizations really looking at the policies, looking at the barriers within your organizations that is preventing your adult colleagues and your providers from getting together. So as an example, when you start a meeting, does it feel transactional or does it feel transformational? Do we get straight to the point or do we actually pause and say, now, how are we feeling today? Is there vulnerability within leadership? If so, how is that cultivated throughout the entire staff? Or if not, why not? right? And it might not be anybody's fault. It's like literally the principal is on this, or parents need this, or I'm down for a staff. Chris, we just need to get to it. Or the day program changed the way they're dismissing in after school. So, you know, we don't have time to sit down and say how we're doing. We recognize that, but really looking at those barriers, and just as one perspective of many that will help to answer this question, Tasha, really cultivating a space where colleagues can come in and say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. This is some of the things that I need to work on. These are some of my healing perspectives that I want to get to that I'm not there yet, which on the flip side, which I will hope that we do more in education that we don't, is to actually have exercises, activities, and conversations about what triggers adults and adult care providers, right? So I said, just personally, I can give you an example. Working in schools, hitting actually doesn't trigger me as much as a lot of my colleagues, right? Like if for whatever reason a young person might be having a challenge, and in this case, more elementary school, but what triggers me is hearing the word no from a young person, right? And I can name that. Is it the young person's fault? Hell no, I gotta deal with that. That's my own thing, right? Ain't got nothing to do with the young person. But to be able to cultivate space and say, you know what, when I hear the word no, for whatever reason, it's triggering for me and I need support on why that happens. I need introspection on why that happens. And having more of those transformative conversations in spaces, Tasha, I have seen in actuality and in practice that it creates more of a connected staff to be able to co-model and co-collaborate and co-build. So I hope that gets partly to the question that you're asking. That's not the overall answer, but I think that hopefully guides and offers a perspective.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thanks, Tasha. Yeah, Chris, you know, it's interesting because all of this is really looking at how is it that we are with each other as adults and using that as a model for how we are in our programs with young people, right? It's reshaping those interactions with each other and then with the young people. Did anybody else want to jump in here?
I'll touch upon that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think about, you know, how often we receive young educators and leaders with the mindset of how many times have we seen an expanded learning educator lead a program similar to what they were taught in school, especially if we're receiving them because they're in junior college now, we decided to take a year off and they want to work in expanded learning programs. So I think, again, I keep hearing it and I wholeheartedly agree. Space, what does that space look like? And being able from your organization or wherever you're coming from is to give that space to say the classroom needs to be set up differently. What are you going to feel? What are young people going to feel, hear, see, smell when they walk into your space? You know, encouraging circle versus like linear, right? So even what the space looks like and feels like, and again, asking the questions, empowering our staff members, leading by example, like Chris said, during our PD professional development. How are we doing land acknowledgements at first? How are we starting with a mindful minute? How are we implementing the practices that we hope that young people will be able to learn as well? So the space, but making sure we shift that mindset.
Since you all kind of touched on the real important stuff in the space, I'll go up into like the institution side of things. Like we all know, anybody who takes ACES funding, it's a shitty system. I don't know if you agree with me, but like the way that the system of ACES funding prioritizes number and then one person and the amount of money you get, like it's incentivizing a real non-youth friendly environment and doesn't necessarily see the practitioners as people to really invest in and be able to kind of cultivate and support. I don't know if that's what you're dealing with, but also think about as some of the adults in the space when we're building, we have to consider, are we supporting our youth workers with the reasonable pay, with enough educational support? Are we able to support them with like, you know, reflection, also the things that you two were talking about, but it's also what are the capital investments as adults that we have to ultimately grapple with when we're in these systems. And granted, not to say it's right, but are we actually giving people 2 hours of prep time? And it's not about nurture nature. It's like both. If you are a young person, authentic, but you're not great at building relationships yet, how can I like support you and kind of pair you and do some development and make you a real professional, even though you're also a young person that might leave, it actually probably increase retention really of those youth workers. Because I think there is again, from a practitioner institutional level, I think there's real messed up kind of like structural systems with the way that we fund after school, and we make it a numbers game and not necessarily a practitioner's game. But that's something we got to think about when we're inside that institution and we have some sort of institutional power. It's like, how can I make sure that we have maybe fewer students so that we could have more adults and kind of deeper relationship? And until we could get more adults or more older folks to be able to be in space, then we could start to expand. But thinking about growing before you could actually create a real institution that can nurture and be there and supportive of young people, you got to make those considerations.
Ren, can I tell Mario, I love that you mentioned that, especially with ACES funding. And I'll mention this, and this is an invitation to anyone who's on here. A few years back, before the ACES increased to $50 million, Prop 49 was the way it was for years, and everything else went up. And we found that, the ratios 20-1 had to exist, and it was, $7 a student. And now it's $10.18. We heard from students like, why is Mr. Such and Such or Miss Such and Such not with us anymore? Because reality is you can't afford to live in the Bay Area or many places throughout the state and the country if you're earning this, but this is the only money we get. Young people at high school, we formed a group. Young people initiated it, and we as adult allies supported a statewide on Zoom. Had I known Zoom would be this popular, I would have invested 5 years ago when we started this. But on Zoom, having young people from San Diego with ARC, Los Angeles with LA All-Stars, and so on, you together, all the way up to Sacramento and Oakland, coming on Zoom every month, talking about what they were doing in their communities in their after-school programs. And this is high school students. And then said, well, this is really relative to what my younger siblings in my community are doing with ACES funding. So when we're talking about housing, when we're talking about, higher, not just a living wage, but a thriving wage and more opportunities and resources, we need to get to the state capitol during the CalSAC challenge. And we as young people can help influence that. And we brought dozens upon dozens of young people to the Capitol for the CalSAC challenge to speak with legislators around the importance of an ACES increase. And again, of course, we need a lot more money, but I wholeheartedly believe that part of that increase a couple of years ago was part of the young people's voice being heard. And it didn't even impact them directly as high school students. We get federal funding, but they were advocating for their siblings, for their community, for higher. And I think we need to continue that, because even $10.18 is not enough. So we have to continue that. So that's just an example. Another example, Marion, you trade that with ACES funding and working within that. Smaller ratios, higher pay, greater outcomes, trusting that, especially at that level with ACES funding. And young people, and I invite, if anyone's interested, we are relaunching that during our Lights On and Expanded Learning on the 28th of October, the relaunch of TACA, Teens Advocating for Civic Action, which is a statewide and open to any middle and high school student that wants to be part of this collaborative group. And there'll be more information coming out from CAN and other organizations that have higher influence.
John, it's so interesting that you said it didn't impact them directly because it was increasing the wage of the youth workers, but it's all started with, hey, where did that person go? How come they're not? So that's like a huge impact. It's like, where are my people? Why are my people disappearing, right?
Totally, absolutely.
Yeah. We have a question here from Jolena. Jolena, would you like to come on and speak your question, or you want me to read it?
Please go ahead and read it.
Okay. Jolena says, I like how a panelist said young people should be trained as activists at a young age, like we do with sports. What are some ideas for engaging young kids as young as 7 years old? My concern is finding the balance between teaching young kids without making them lose too much of their innocence and making them jaded. I could actually jump in here. So my experience is that there are, all people share concerns, even young people. And I was in a school where the youth had organized, and I was supporting a conflict management program. And it was cascading. So it started with the 6th graders who were first conflict managers. And then every other grade got interested and was like, hey, I want to be a conflict manager. I want to be a conflict manager. And so we went down through all the grade levels with the older kids, teaching the younger ones how to be conflict managers and running this program. And one day I walked into the school and the kindergartners came up to me and said, hey, Ren, we have a big problem. And I was like, no, I'm so sorry. What is your problem? And they said, well, when we're in the yard and we're playing with the ball, if the ball gets kicked down the hill, we are not allowed to go retrieve the ball. And so we can't play anymore. And I was like, yes, this is a very big problem. What do you think you could do about it? And they said to me that they had an idea. And their idea was they could be ball monitors. And they could organize themselves so that the ball monitors changed. And the conflict managers, we got them fancy vests to wear to identify them as conflict managers. So they were like, we could wear a vest that identified us as ball monitors, and one ball monitor or 2 ball monitors could be allowed to go retrieve the ball and bring it back. So there is nothing in that particular scenario that indicates to me that they lost any innocence, but only gained a huge amount of agencies because they organized themselves around something that was important to them, being able to play.
I also think that example really illustrates even what, older folks, the way that the simplicity of like solving a small problem in my community, my neighborhood, my household, that the ability to be able to ideate and say, this is a problem, I got to solve it. And how do I kind of utilize my resources and understand levers of power in my orbit, parent, church, clergy, whatever it is. Because that is really it, right? Is like, how do I understand myself and my own needs and the needs of the people around me? And then how do we kind of help nurture those needs, and how does everyone get what they need, right? And that's really kind of what it comes to when you kind of drill that down. Even as we get older, it's still the same thing, except we're playing in a different game where we're pulling bigger levers of power to get the things that we just need to be healthy. And so then how do you cultivate the skill in understanding who you are, what you need in your home, how do you interact with your orbit, and learn about certain things so that then allows you to continue to like help you and your community meet your needs.
Thanks. Okay, we have a couple more questions in our Q&A area. Let me just bring that over. Let's see, Olivia is saying, are there any tips on beginning to have these kinds of conversations, answer questions and ask questions and provide space in an age-appropriate way for young people, for younger youth? Olivia, we'll bring you on. Olivia, you want to expand on that a little more, or just leave it and let the panelist answer?
A little bit. So basically what I'm thinking of is because of like all of the things that are happening in the news and people or kids are talking about stuff in classrooms. And I hear youth in my after school program talking about different topics, or they may ask me questions, but I've got a range of students, young as age 5 up to age 12. And so I sometimes wonder, like if they come up and they ask me a big question or they're talking about this really important topic, how do I, as the adult, manage that, monitor that, and make sure that it's productive and that they get something out of it instead of just shutting it down?
I think that's huge. I think, I've had, when I was a direct service instructor in in one of schools in fourth grade when I first moved out here. I remember young people coming up to me asking me questions, and I would throw it back. Well, what do you know about this particular issue? How do you feel about it? Goes back to what Ren was saying earlier, and putting it back on them. I always caution on like thinking about the parent. As a parent of a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old myself, I always think about like, what are the influences at my children's schools and the conversations that are happening in the spaces that are provided. And I would say that not shutting it down, again, unless it's something for you that you feel it isn't something that you're ready to have, or you or your colleagues. But I would say asking the open-ended questions for that student to start to think critically, because I think a lot of those skills, if you're in first grade, second grade, the ball example that Ren just gave, those skills, I'm thinking about the transferable trajectory. A lot of those skills are going to, the feeling that a young person gets by feeling agency and empowered will translate into secondary school. So, caution, depending on what the topic is, well, what do you know about this? And where'd you hear about it? And what do you think about it? And, is anyone else, any of your friends interested as well? So that's how I would approach it, or my suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay, we have, Sam has a couple of questions that I'm going to group together. He asks, what are the legal and ethical issues, and how do we start? Like, what's the first step here? What do we do? Any legal and ethical issues?
I'd like to hear a little bit more. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, we'll give Sam a minute to type in a little bit more on the legal ethical. I'm assuming, John, you want to hear more about?
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about what.
And then let's go with, while he's doing that, let's go with how to start. What are the first steps?
Yeah, I think, young people, we know they like to be engaged in different ways, right? And we know they like to be engaged often through activities, right? So oftentimes, we know, depending on the age of young person, if you sit them down, sometimes it's very effective. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what are your thoughts. But oftentimes it's not, because young people either don't have the language or don't have the wording or not in the space to be able to express it in a way that can connect the dots in that way. So, one of the things that we all have tools here, right, working with young people for so long, is these different activities that we can engage in and to be able to capture that as a way, right? But the first thing I would say, and that's a great question, Sam, is really, again, focus on the young person's identity, like really focus on who they are. So as an example, we have an actual activity called Who Am I? And if you want to bear with me for a second, remember, everybody knows the Jabberwockies, right? They got the white mask, it's blank on this side, it's blank on that side. So the activity is about an hour or so, but I'll explain it in about, a minute, because you can do this in many different ways. But you'll ask the young person, and the beautiful thing, you can do this with your adult staff and caregivers as well, right? So you ask the young person with markers, with crayons, with stickers, whatever it is they want to lean into, with nothing, right? On the outside of the mask, explain and write and draw who you are and how you think other people see you. So people draw pictures, fierce, strong, tough, whatever that is, right? And then next question, on the inside of that mask, where you put over you, who are you actually? And even that activity right there can give you so much insight to what a young person feels they should be outwardly facing to everybody else, and who they actually are. You can actually see a lot of vulnerability in a lot of those questions. So the first steps is to really identify that your vulnerability and your strength is honored, and who you are right now is enough. I know we talk a lot about aspirations, and I brought that up plenty of times, but before we even get to that point, we also recognize that who you are as a young person, whether you're 5 years old, you're 10 years old, I acknowledge you, I see you, you are enough in this moment. And activity like that, between what is put on that mask, what's not put on that mask, there are guiding questions with it and everything, right? As an adult provider, that tells you a lot about, all right, this is where this young person is with me, right? We can gauge how safe this young person feels with me, how vulnerable this young person feels with me, how vulnerable and safe this young person feels with peers in this space that I've cultivated. So little things like that give you insight as starters about where to really start to design your path. So I would suggest just leaning into a lot of activities, and activities that you won't even realize are really intended for this, but really can give you, as the adult provider, the framework you need to really continue to empower the young person to have collective voice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Chris, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add on, yeah, definitely want to echo the starting with activities, definitely centering relationship building and them getting to know you, you getting to know them and building that trust, and then starting to infuse the skill building, the political education in that work slowly. And then also to continue to do your own learning as a provider, as a coordinator, in whatever adult role that you have. Thinking of around trainings around one, just like adolescent brain development or disability justice, gender justice, restorative justice, like continuing, like building up those skill sets to help continue to support how you show up as an adult ally for young people. And so it's the learning both for the young person and for the adult lead. And then building, I think something that's really been helpful is building a beloved community of adult allies so that you aren't alone in that process. And so bringing in other folks who may have an expertise in a different topic or a different campaign area or can lead an activity, but also to be a support or sounding board for you as you're going through this journey as well.
Love that beloved community phrase, beloved community. One of the things that when Chris was talking about the mask activity, it reminded me of our colleague, Shanti Branch, who has an organization called Ever Forward Club. And he's got right now something called the $100,000 mask project, where he's got where you can go on and you can do exactly those kinds of things. How people see me and how I really am. Yeah, it's a beautiful, powerful exercise.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I actually am meeting with Ashanti at 12:30 right after this, and to talk about and purchasing some of the new box sets he put together for 6 of my schools. And then we're going to throw out this Oakland-wide kind of mask, workshop. So yeah, I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Sam has put in a chat here regarding the legal ethical issues, and Sabina, I see you. We will get to we'll get to Ronnie's last question here, but it looks like he's really thinking about legal issues with off-campus protests and dealing with those issues between the schools and or your organization. What kind of legal issues are there, or should people be aware of, or are there legal issues?
I'm sure there are from a school perspective. I mean, I would try to subvert that a little bit if I was on school. I work out of school, so I don't have any relationship with school in that, but I don't, yeah, it's a tough one. I don't know.
I both have the experience of planning a walkout as a high school student and also supporting young people in planning protests or actions as an adult ally. I think what was helpful for me as a young person was that it was actually something that was 100% youth led and adults weren't a part of it. But provided the information we needed. And so training from the ACLU has a lot of trainings and pamphlets around youth activism or knowing your rights around how to protest and what are your, in relation to schools, in communication with the police and so on. And so that was helpful in helping us in providing like safe space and how to keep folks safe in the streets and so on. During the school day, the schools are liable for student safety. And so their big thing is going to be around how to keep students safe. And so I would say this is a place where young people would need to step into their own leadership, and then the organizations you work with will have to make a decision what's your role and how you step in to support young people, and how to be a liaison and advocate for young people, both within the school and also with the police, because police are often going to be the ones called to either keep students in the building or to keep or to try to contain them once they're out in the streets. And there's a lot of different ways that protests can happen. There could be a protest that happens after school, and so there's not it's not keeping kids out of school. They're not walking out. Maybe it's something that happens on the weekend. Maybe it's a direct action. Doing a banner drop is a form of protest. There's many different forms of protest. So, and then the risk, depending on what form of protest there is, it comes with different level of risk, or folks that have kind of fear of what could happen. I would say in my role more as an adult is really supporting and advising young people to be able to do what they really want to do, but doing so in a way that continues to put forth their vision, the issue that they're fighting for, but keeps them and the people they're convening safe, and that they have the tools and resources to do that. And so not taking ownership as RYSE. There was young people who did a couple of protests over the last summer during the uprising for Black Lives. And it wasn't like, well, if I step in, this is a RYSE thing. No, these are young people who are stepping into their leadership, who are taking to the streets. And I'm going to advise them on how, because they've sought out our support, but it's their protest and it's not ours. And so we have to also step back and allow that to happen.
Yeah.
There's a lot of organizations who do youth organizing, like on school campuses, to learn from as well. And I can share some, but there's folks who do it, and so it's not happening. Like Youth Together that was lifted up, or Oakland Kids First, who John lifted up, who worked on the Measure QQ campaign in Oakland. And so there's folks who are doing organizing and civic engagement and activism as school programs and after school programs, or clubs that meet during lunchtime, and are also organizing young people outside of school. And so it's possible, and there are organizations who are making it happen.
Yeah, I would also just add that each school district will have specific policies around student walkouts during the school day, and those are important to consult, so you know what the policies are. Okay, Ronnie's question. Ronnie, I can bring you on. Would you like to read out your question? Or shall I read it for you?
Sure, Stacy. I'll read it. Ren, forgive me. Okay, my question is.
I accidentally opened up my AirPods and it changed mine.
Oh.
Oh, I'm hearing things. Okay, Ronnie's question is, what importance do you place on social media as platform for social action? How do we teach critical thinking so students can discern between facts and fantasy as they make important decisions on what and how to get involved? So how does social media play into all of this?
It's a vehicle. It's a vehicle for voice to be heard in a different way. I can actually, let's see if I share a link,
John, I can't hear you.
Check 1, 2.
Can you hear him?
Can everyone else
hear him?
Oh,
I can hear him.
Okay.
It's something about your pods. It might be the audio setting. But I know our young people, when they are organizing, they will use social media as a way to get, the voice heard and some action. Here's one example. This is a campaign happening now, October through June. We're getting some young people who are going to be earning some funds for that, but also this is the healthy options at point of sale, the HOPS program. So allowing young people, and you know, they know more about it. So some students in one of the programs I work with said, you know, there's these TikTok challenges that are popping up, and some of them are about harming educators in after school and teachers. October Slap a Teacher Month, right? So our students were like, well, you know, how do we get teachers to stop the lesson for the day, right? Because we asked, well, what could we do about that? And a student said, how do we get teachers to stop a lesson for the day? You know, and talk about like they're here risking COVID. Most of them are underpaid, right? Teaching in one of the craziest times, and building that relationship with the student before even jumping into a lesson and having the student ask questions. And then students were like, well, we can create like a TikTok challenge, but the challenge is around something more positive, something about acknowledging, et cetera. So that's the voice. I'm curious to see how that transpires. But social media is one of the largest platforms we can use right now for voice getting out there.
But as
Yeah, I
we see
think
now,
Responsibly as well.
Go ahead, Mario.
okay, I think what we got to point out is that, I mean, we're seeing it right now play out with the algorithm is a challenge, right? And I think that you speak to that, and part of this question too is like, how do you kind of discern between fact and fiction? And it's different. And so that's kind of one of those skills, is like, well, how do I triangulate information? How do I understand? How do I question it? But you know, that's the hardest part. And then in the algorithm, to John's point, is like how much traction is something positive going to get? And right now we're learning, and we've known this for a long time, that like positivity and like excitement doesn't necessarily get lifted up in the algorithm, right? It's things that'll anger you and upset you, and things that they'll be divisive. And so, you know, we have to really kind of think about like how these platforms are going to continue to do business, and that's a whole nother justice issue. And something as practitioners is think about like, well, how do you ask questions? Because people are going to come at, in particular, with young people from, you know, they have brought up a lot of like conspiracy theory stuff in space, and you know, it's not my space to be like, oh, you're hella wrong, that's stupid. Instead, it's like, well, let's just ask more questions, like who's hearing what sources are we getting from? Can we trust them? Like, you know, and then having a reasonable conversation about how do we move forward together. It's time and intention.
Jamila, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think as it relates to social action, we've seen the power that social media has played with Black Lives Matter. Social media has helped start and build revolutions in other countries. It is a powerful tool. You can use it for education, agitation, base building, outreach for programs or for events or actions. There's a lot of different ways that it could be used, but it can't be the only tool that you're using or your primary strategy for all of that to happen. And so it can't replace the like person-to-person relationship building and outreach. But like in thinking about civic engagement and even doing voter outreach and education, social media is definitely a tool, especially around election season. But that's also coupled with phone banking and text banking and doing door-to-door canvassing pre-COVID and all of those other kind of traditional ways of getting out there and connecting with folks and educating folks around what's on the ballot or what's coming up for their communities. It's a strategy, but it shouldn't be the only one. And so how do you use it as a strategy in your campaign to amplify the powerful work that's already happening on the ground, and how to reach a broader base of folks who maybe you may not have connected with if it wasn't for social media. And I think there's just like what Mario lifted up around this being like another justice issue. There's an organization called Media Justice, and they've been doing a lot of stuff, especially around the pandemic, around misinformation that's often targeting Black and Brown communities as it related to COVID and vaccines. And so if folks are interested in learning more around just like how to kind of discern and support community and thinking about misinformation or even misinformation that's put out during times of civil unrest, there's a lot of resources that that organization has put out there.
All right, so we are ending our time together, and I wanted just to throw open the mic to invite any of our panelists who want to share any last thoughts. And also, if there's anybody out there listening who would like to make a final comment or jump in on this conversation, you can raise your hand. But I'll start with the panelists. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
My thought is that if you can be as inclusive as possible with offering young people the opportunity to be youth activists, civically engaged, and offering them that opportunity. I've seen specialized programs. Like we're having this class here or a leadership group, but in every offering, the space that you create and the questions that we'll ask and the young people will ask each other will hopefully support the opportunity for mobilization and transformation. And thank you for allowing me to share space with you today.
Thanks, John.
100, everybody, appreciations to John, Mario, Jamile, Ren, everybody on this call, for the collective work that we all put in for the love of our young people. My last things and other things I just want to lift up is just recognizing that no idea is too small, y'all. Every everything, every example that we cited today from Baltimore down to LA, Oakland first with Lucas Brecky and the great work that they do, it all started with idea, whether it came from a young person or the support of an adult provider. So every small idea that gets emphasized, every small idea, every action step that gets put into play, even if it just changes something within the context of the day of your classroom, makes a difference, y'all. And it creates a sense of joy, or it creates a sense of agency and eventually aspirations that will lead to some of these bigger transformational changes that we're looking for. So just want to thank Ren and Sam and the entire team, Temescal, and thank you for continuing to do what you do, and especially to our providers here and our adult practitioners, man. I know it can be lonely at times, but continue to do what you do because y'all amazing. Y'all are truly amazing. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
I think I'll just, reiterate, because the thing I had in my mind was like, whatever civic action you decide to take, or however, wherever you decide to start, I think one of the most important pieces that we got to think about is like, how do we, to Chris's point, like really lead with joy and community and being in space with one another, then things will come more naturally. And I think we got to keep that in mind. Is like, I know there's a lot of shit happening in this world right now, in this country, in our immediate. Sometimes we got to find space to be light and love and be together, and that will then allow us to kind of be more powerful.
Jamile, you have a final sentiment for us?
Just a lot of appreciations and really hopeful that if folks can continue to either do the work that you're doing or even explore in integrating civic engagement and activism in your programs, I look forward to just what comes from all of that and all the powerful work young people will continue to do to help make our communities transformational. And just wanting to offer, if there's any folks who would like to get in touch, I'm sure our names or contact information will be shared, but I'm always interested and open to continuing conversations after today.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that you will get a copy of this video. The people who have attended will get a copy of this video, the webinar video. It's also going to be posted on the How Kids Learn YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know, you can check out My Pal Luke, which is an emotional support dog for the young people in our lives. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on. Wish you all a beautiful day, and I'll send you out with a little music. Peace, everyone.
The lo-fi playlist.
A little lo-fi.
Ren, would you like the panelists to remain on?
I don't think so. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for coming on. Mario, hope you feel better. Jamile, I'll be in contact about curriculum, something.
Bye, everybody.
John? Thank you.